Good morning from Baltimore, Maryland in the U.S. I regret greatly that I am not with you at the Academia Engelberg Conference on Food Security in Switzerland. Circumstances simply would not allow me to travel at this time. But I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share with you some thoughts on a global view of food security for 10 billion people. The late Jim Grant, who was Secretary of UNICEF until his untimely death in 1993, spoke about the vicious spiral of poverty, population growth, and environmental degradation. This vicious spiral inspired a group of us here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health to examine more closely the relationship between food production, environment, public health, and the quality of the food that people are able to access. So this picture of the early signs of rising waters and heralding the challenges of climate change and their impact on our food security sets the stage for thinking about this relationship. Schools of public health, of course, have for years been strong in nutritional science. They've also had very good departments of environmental health sciences, as does our school. But with the industrialization of agriculture, it appeared to me that we needed to examine more closely the changes in food production and how those changes are impacting both the ecosystem and the diet to produce challenges to public health. The external drivers here of population growth, climate disruption, the lack of equity, and resource depletion, of course, make this a very complicated and challenging problem. This figure shows the space in which we are going to have to operate for the next several generations if we are to accommodate 10 billion people on this planet. The lower arc are the social boundaries. We're already slipping across those social boundaries with almost 1 billion people malnourished around the world and 1.5 billion people overweight or obese. But it's going to become even more critical for equitable distribution of resources to stay within those social boundaries. The top arc are the planetary boundaries. Again, we have seen with the dramatic increase in CO2 levels, methane, nitrous oxide, other greenhouse gases, that the climate change already underway is threatening to push us beyond those planetary boundaries. So what can we do to stay within this safe and just pathway toward food security for 10 billion people? The current situation in terms of distribution of poverty is really daunting. The Millennium Development Goals set a target for 2015, just 1 year away now. That fine yellow line that bisects most of these bar graphs is the level of people living on less than $1.25 per day that the original Millennium Development Goals hoped for by 2015. You can see that we're probably falling far short of that. The population pressure, of course, is not evenly distributed throughout the world. In Europe, parts of Eastern China, Japan, total fertility rate has actually fallen below the replacement level of 2.1. We are still in the United States increasing largely because of the additional immigration of people from various parts of the world. But the disproportionate pressure in terms of resources, income, and so on will come from population growth in low and lower middle income countries. The actual projected population growth as a percentage of the population increase between 2010 and 2100 is shown in this graphic. The darker areas of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Afghanistan, interestingly enough, and of course pockets of significant population growth in Latin America. We have resource depletion going on at a non-renewable rate. It's a very sobering reality that most of the global population now lives in countries where resource depletion is exceeding recharge. Some of the resources are, of course, totally depleted. We are at peak oil. We're now thinking about peak phosphorus coming in 40 or 50 years, with the major resource in Morocco steadily being depleted. Other resources like soil and water, of course, are partially recharged if we manage to change our behaviors and farming practices. But of increasing concern to economists as they look at resource balance and extraction are the countries like Brazil and Russia, Indonesia, China, India, and South Africa, where they are really extracting at a rate that we haven't seen in Europe and North America since the early part of the 20th century. The supplies of fresh water, of course, are finite. We have many, many aquifers around the world that are diminishing, some at the rate of 20 centimeters per year. The northern China Plain, the Punjab in India, the Ogallala aquifer in the western United States, being pumped down at a rate that exceeds the recharge from the hydrologic cycle. This is leading to water scarcity throughout the world. This chart shows two kinds of water scarcity. The absolute water scarcity for those parts of the world where the hydrologic cycle simply does not yield an abundant rainfall, such as the southwestern United States, currently gripped in a very severe drought. Large swaths of western and northern China, of course the Sahara, just north of the Sahara in the Maghreb, and throughout the Middle East. But the dark purple coloration in Africa relates to economic scarcity. The hydrologic cycle is actually abundant in these areas, but there's insufficient capital to manage the water so that it simply runs off into rivers and streams and is not available for agriculture. The result is that without access to modern techniques of irrigation, there are large areas of the Sahel and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa where insufficient water is one of the major barriers to food security. We have, for the first time, relative unanimity in a recent report from scientists that say now in 4 different studies that the tremendous heat in Australia last year, the end of 2013 and early 2014, was clearly linked to global warming. There's been great speculation over the recent decades about individual weather events, such as the current drought in southwestern United States. But for the first time, there is real consensus that the very, very high temperatures in Australia are clearly linked to climate change. So we have challenges for real prospects of severe drought in many of the most productive agricultural areas of the world. The depletion of soil and soil degradation, yet another challenge. This map of the world shows areas that have had significant degradation of soil, and you see that good swath of North America, South America, Europe, and much of sub-Saharan Africa, as well as South Asia and East Asia, have had severely degraded soils. In Iowa, for example, a steady state is regarded as the loss of 5 tons of soil per acre per year. This is the sustainable portion of this chart is in quotations because nobody truly believes that we can lose soil at that rate given how long it takes for new soil to develop. But nonetheless, even at that rate, you see that significant acreage in Iowa is losing topsoil at a rate of greater than 10 tons per acre per year, a lesser amount of acreage at greater than 15 tons, and then even some greater than 20 tons. Iowa is the quintessential American farm state with 29 million acres. Almost all of it is now in corn and soybeans, row cropping, which does not provide sufficient cover to protect the soil from heavy rains and dramatic weather events. Gradually, cover crops are being introduced to try to stabilize the soil, and of course many of the people living in the Farm Belt still have vivid memories of the Dust Bowl that afflicted the United States during the 1930s. We are also concerned about the loss of biodiversity. The great transitions have always been characterized by enormous die-offs of species. And now that we're beginning to talk about the Anthropocene, having the impact of human activity on biologic systems since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, has dramatically altered the balance of nature and our relationship to the ecosystem. In the United States today, we're in the midst of a very alarming decrease in the monarch butterfly, which has a complex life cycle, requires feasting on a particular plant, the milkweed. Milkweed population in the United States has been severely diminished by the widespread application of Roundup, a potent herbicide that is overused for soybean and other crop production. This is just one of many, many examples. It's thought that species loss at the moment is going on at a rate about 1,000 times greater than was occurring just before the onset of the Industrial Revolution. So the implications of this are rather profound for resilience as we see increasing monocultures of specific genomes for soybeans, for corn, sorghum, rice, and so forth, makes them vulnerable to new plant pathogens. A few years ago in Brazil, the large tracts of soybeans, which were all monoculture, the same specific plant cultivar, a new rust appeared, and before it was brought under control, about 40% of the crop was lost. We have energy use that is a real challenge for agriculture. The average U.S. farm requires about 3 kilocalories of fossil energy to produce 1 kilocalorie of food energy. For feedlot cattle, of course, this is much, much worse. Total requirement is about 35 kilocalories of fossil energy for the production of 1 kilocalorie of food energy. This is clearly unsustainable and will have to be one of the first things to go in order for us to remain within that safe pathway between the social boundaries and the planetary boundaries. I've already mentioned briefly the concept of peak oil. I'm sure all of you have followed this discussion. And here, with the possible small exception of a little upward tick because of the exploitation of Marcellus shale and the Alberta tar sands in North America, we're seeing that the actual production of oil globally is very closely following the Hubbert curve that was predicted 30 years ago. Fossil fuels, of course, are an important part of production of synthetic pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and driving the farm machinery, the transportation, and so much else that's part of our complex global food system. So we need to begin thinking about energy reduction practices in agriculture and plant cultivation, but we also need to think about changing the balance between natural fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers, and making higher use of integrated pest management and less reliance on synthetic pesticides. You're all very familiar, I know, with the so-called hockey stick graphs that every time I see them, I am truly struck by how rapid the accumulation of these three potent greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And for a while, climatologists were saying that the impact of rising CO2 levels on agricultural production was probably going to actually be in a positive direction. And now the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually predicts that we are going to see diminished productivity because of rising greenhouse gases and increasing global warming. So the Anthropocene is a big challenge. We're going to have to deal with this as we go forward if we are to have any hope of providing food security for 10 billion people. The original prediction for agricultural productivity is shown in this map, where the ability to increase crop with longer growing seasons and so forth pushed up in North America into the northern tier of U.S. states, the southern tier of Canadian provinces, with considerable increase of crop yield as shown in the dark green, with loss of crop yield in the darker colors around the equator. We now know that these shifts are already happening. Climate zones, any gardener in Europe or North America will be able to quickly tell you that they're now able to support particular varieties of ornamental shrubs, or perhaps grow a particular vegetable that they were not able to do 10 years ago. When we look more closely, however, we see that the projected changes to crop yields related to climate change are very, very sobering. The further out we go, the more the bar graphs shift in the direction of decreased yield, and those bar graphs in various shades of blue that started out being on a parallel of areas of the globe that would benefit from climate change in terms of increased crop yields are now steadily declining. So this is going to be an enormous challenge on top of everything else that I have discussed so far. The lack of equity continues to be a source of great concern in terms of stable societies, conflict resolution, and simple compassion for the needs of our fellow citizens. The human rights movement since World War II has articulated the right to food as one of the essential rights of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And yet we see from this distribution that there are significant groups of people who are being denied the right to food and to food security, concentrated in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Africa and South Asia, and in the Western Hemisphere, in Bolivia, parts of Peru, and parts of Ecuador. With the lack of equity, we realize that most of the world's poor who are currently suffering from lack of food security are actually small farmers. The figures vary, 850 million to closer to 1 billion people who are malnourished, mixtures of protein caloric malnutrition and micronutrient malnutrition. One very sobering statistic that sticks in my mind is one of my colleagues here at the School of Public Health who works in Cambodia tells me that about 55% of the children, school-age children in Cambodia, are stunted. And when we see nutritional stunting, short stature and so forth, we now know that there's also cognitive stunting. So these have profound impacts on societies over generations and urgently call for solutions now, not waiting another 1, 2, or 3 decades. But if we were able to provide greater support for smallholder farmers, increased availability of food production, subsistence farming, better crops, better access to markets, protection from the subsidies of commodities by the United States government, by Australia, Canada, and Europe, we would be able to allow these people to actually use the resources at hand to improve their food security. The urban poor make up about 20% of this population, and then of course we have other rural inhabitants who are not actually farmers. When we think about hunger in the world today, it is actually not a problem of producing enough food. It's a problem of poverty. It's a problem of climate and weather. If I stop and think for a moment about food waste, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we have learned recently that about 35 to 40% of food produced in North America is actually wasted. And in low-income countries, a comparable amount. And the distribution of that food waste varies. In low-income countries, much of the food is actually wasted at the source of production or storage because of inadequate access to proper grain bins with drying facilities and so forth. Whereas in high-income countries like the United States, almost all of the food waste is at the consumer level. We simply buy more than we eat. We let it sit and rot in our refrigerators. If we could do something about that food waste and divert it to people who are currently food insecure, we would go a long way towards solving the problem. War and displacement, of course, are constant disturbances of food security, both through the population movement, but more importantly through disrupting the ability to plant and harvest. And then we have the problem of unstable markets because of trade policies that do not honor and protect the rights of small landholders. If we think now for a moment about the changes in the food system that we have seen, this tremendous shift toward industrialization with concentration, consolidation, specialization, we have had a increasing reliance on large-scale agriculture, making it more and more difficult for the small-scale farmer to survive. The industrialization of food production has been defined as a system in agriculture based on the principles of industrial revolution of the 19th and 20th century. In terms of concentration and specialization, we've had a tremendous decline in the total number of farms. This slide shows the U.S. agriculture as defined by the shift from very many small farms to many fewer large farms. And the total number of farms has declined precipitously in the last 40 or 50 years. We've actually seen the average farm size increase quite dramatically, even though the total land under cultivation has remained about the same. The industrial food animal production story follows a very similar pattern. The top slide shows the distribution of poultry processing plants in the United States back in 1949. Each of those dots represents a poultry processing facility capable of handling 50,000 birds a year. By 2007, you see the consolidation in each of these dots now represents a processing plant capable of processing a million broilers per year. And the so-called broiler belt that starts in the mid-Atlantic states and sweeps down through the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, over into Arkansas and East Texas is a highly concentrated collection of production facilities with about 8 billion, that's with a B, broilers now being grown each year. When we look at each typical U.S. farm, back in 1900, there were about 5 commodities produced per farm. This might be sweet corn, wheat, oats, perhaps a small herd of dairy cows, chickens, and so forth. By the turn of the century, 2002, the average number of commodities per farm is 1.1. We now have farms of 1,500, 2,000 acres, or 700 to 1,000 hectares in the United States that are totally producing monocrops, alternating corn and soybeans, most of which, of course, goes to animal feed rather than to feeding humans directly. The corn-soy behemoth, as it's been called, is dominant in our agricultural economy, and it has all of the problems associated with intensive row cropping, loss of soil, overconsumption of water, reliance on highly synthetic inputs of pesticides, fertilizers, and of course the energy to drive the irrigation pumps to produce the drive the large farm equipment and so forth. The problem in terms of diversity and market control is also illustrated by this graphic that shows the amount of the swine, poultry, and beef industry controlled by the top 4 corporations in the United States, starting with 1980 through 2010. This approach to agriculture, and especially this approach to integrated, vertically integrated industrial food animal production, is simply not compatible with resource conservation and with equitable distribution of food to people around the world. Our consumption of meat, making us one of the highest meat-consuming countries in the world, has actually been almost entirely driven in recent decades by the increase in broiler production and consumption by the American people. The global picture is similar. We now have about 55 billion food animals being raised globally each year, the vast majority of which are poultry, as in the United States. But I'm embarrassed to say that the United States leads the world in over-reliance on animal protein. When we look at the meat consumption comparisons with the US on the far right, over 200 pounds per capita per year. The other industrialized nations are down around 155 or 60. The global developing country picture is about 51 or 52 pounds per capita per year. And the green bar represents what our own American Heart Association, from a pure human health perspective, would recommend at less than 150 pounds per capita per year. But if you superimpose health considerations on climate change realities and food security for 10 billion people, then obviously, as I'll say in a few minutes, meat has to decline much more sharply than that. Here's the picture for the world. The only bright spot really is that it looks as though we will not have a huge increase in per capita meat consumption in India, but China already is the world's largest consumer of pork. About 450 million pigs per year are slaughtered in China, and their total consumption of pork represents about 55% of the world's total, with their having about 18% of the population. The other interesting thing about meat consumption in China is that they now are totally dependent on importing animal feed in order to support their livestock production. The Brazilian Amazon rainforest has about 16% of the hydrologic cycle and only about 1% of the world's population, whereas China, with 18% of the world's population, only controls about 11% or 10% of the hydrologic cycle. So this big imbalance in terms of water resources for food production is now being resolved to China's satisfaction by the transport of virtual water from the Amazon to China in the form of soybeans. It takes about 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of grain. So for every ton of soybeans produced in what used to be tropical rainforest in the Amazon basin, China receives the equivalent of 1,000 tons of Amazon rainfall. We have a number of so-called externalities in the U.S. food production system. These are costs to the environment and to human health that are not reflected in the retail price of food at our grocery stores, but are rather socialized to the general population to pay the cost of industrial food animal production. The major way in which we are not capturing the true cost of production is in the access to our increasingly scarce supply of fresh water. You can see the tremendous differences in this slide between growing the crops to produce the animal feed and then supporting the animal during its life cycle versus having the water go directly toward growing crops that are then consumed by humans without going through animals. About 17 to 32% of greenhouse gases are currently coming from the food system, and we see that the combination of red meat at 30% and dairy at 18% makes up a very, very large part of that total burden. 48% in total. And this is also simply not sustainable. Dairy, of course, can be transformed into smaller herd-sized pasture-raised animals with a significant decrease in water consumption. But these figures are based on what has now become the norm in high-income countries and in many middle-income countries of vast dairy herds, some as large as 15,000 animals in the Yakima Valley of the eastern part of Washington state. The inefficiencies in meat production are captured in this ratio. These are conservative numbers, about 700 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of beef. Some estimates say it should be more like 1,000 kilos of grain for a kilo of beef. About 650 kilograms of grain to produce 100 kilograms of pork, and about 260 kilos for 100 kilos of poultry, making poultry, for all of its other problems, actually one of the more efficient feed to meat conversion animals. We are paying the price now for this increasing appetite for meat. Land clearing for feed grain production and land clearing for pasture has been going on around the world. Perhaps only the forest clearing in Indonesia for palm oil production rivals what we have seen in the interests of expanding the production of beef. This graphic was developed by my colleagues at the Center for a Livable Future back at a time when we were having a school-wide event, and each center and department in the school was asked to capture in a single graphic what it was doing. We took the data that Norman Borlaug, the late Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his development of high-yield wheat varieties in Mexico that gave birth to the Green Revolution. He was asked in 1995 by the Union of Concerned Scientists to estimate the carrying capacity of the Earth. The broad red plane is the population, and we could continue that up to the 10 billion figure. The hamburger slide is representative of how many people could be fed in the world in 1990 if everybody was eating a North American high meat diet. And you can see that it's a very small proportion of the total population at that time. However, there was sufficient food actually being produced had it been fed directly to people in a predominantly plant-based diet. There would have been enough to feed 6.1 billion people at a time when the population was 5 billion. So we had a safety margin of 1.1 billion. The problem, therefore, being the distribution of food and the kind of food being consumed. Projecting forward, you can see the same relationship hold, although we now know that in 1995, Norman Borlaug was probably being a little bit optimistic about the productivity, the increases in productivity of food. As I've mentioned earlier, climate change is casting significant doubt. But nonetheless, the relationship between the capacity to feed people everywhere and the quality and the quantity of the diet is directly linked. We simply cannot afford to have the high meat diet continue in high-income countries, and we certainly can't afford to have it spread to those parts of the world where the population is increasing rapidly. In the Lancet, a recent paper looked at the recommendations in terms of what would be a good proportion of the diet to be related to meat. The current U.S. diet, about 8.8 grams, and the USDA's own dietary recommendation is 5.5. The Lancet recommended, based on healthy heart diet, 12, and then based on reducing greenhouse gases down to 1.8. So I think clearly, as we accumulate more data and more information about food security around the world, 1.8 may even seem too generous. In summary then, let's consider food security and the way forward. First introduced by the 1996 World Food Summit, further defined in 2001, the state of food security. The definition we now use is that food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And others have added, and I would support this, and food is produced in ways that are environmentally sound and socially just. There are four pillars of food security. First, of course, is food availability. It has to be sufficient in quantities that will be available on a consistent basis. You have to have access to the food, sufficient resources to obtain it, appropriate food for a nutritious diet. Food use, appropriate use based on knowledge of basic nutrition and care, as well as adequate water and sanitation. And then stability of the first three dimensions over time. But food security is complex. WHO said that it's a complex, sustainable development issue linked to health through malnutrition, but also to sustainable economic development, environment, and trade. There's a great deal of debate around food security, with some arguing that there's enough food in the world to feed everyone adequately. The problem is distribution. And that was certainly the case back in the 90s when Norman Borlaug made that analysis for the Union of Concerned Scientists. But future needs can or cannot be met by current levels of production. National food security is paramount, or it's no longer necessary because of global trade. And these debates continue today. And globalization may or may not lead to the persistence of food insecurity and poverty in rural communities. The right to food, introduced in Article 11 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, states very clearly that every government that has signed and ratified this covenant, and it now represents about 170 of the 193 member states of the United Nations, recognizes the right of all citizens to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food. The Kuala Lumpur Guidelines for Human Rights Approach to Economic Policy and Agriculture in 2010 identified three significant threats to economic, social, and cultural rights in agriculture: commercialization and monopolization and market concentration, as we've talked about, the restriction of seed use. The top three corporations now control 54% of global market, and there are penalties being imposed on farmers for setting seed aside for the next year's crop. Inputs, the top 6 companies control 75% of the global market. With regard to broiler poultry, the top 3 control 95% of market share, and the swine top 4 control 67% of industrial research and development. The GMO seed challenge, intellectual property rights, and chemical inputs are also distorting the ability of small landholders to produce food. Agrofuels and the competition between food and energy. We've seen tremendous distortions in the United States with corn ethanol now taking up about 25% of the corn crop. The notion of food sovereignty is gaining traction in many parts of the world, and the statement at the Livia Campesina said that the right of food to determine their own food and agriculture policies should be based on the following principles: focusing on the right to food for everyone, values food producers and providers, localizes food systems and links products and consumers, places the control locally with farmers and consumers, strengthens and shares local knowledge and skills, and works with nature to build resilience. As we look to future generations, we have to invest in smallholder farming and economically viable agricultural economies. About 500 million smallholder farms currently support over 2 billion people. The adoption of agroecology with the diversity of crops and livestock in a system that works with and harnesses nature, what Aldo Leopold called the land ethic. Sustainable intensification with higher yields but using fewer resources, and then strengthening regional food systems. There also has to be this global shift in dietary consumption patterns with decreased meat consumption in high-income countries and greater access to sustainably produced iron and protein-rich animal food sources in low and middle-income countries. Investment in agriculture has been shown to be 5 times more effective in reducing poverty and hunger than investment in any other sector of the economy. We must invest in women farmers. We must make improvements in infrastructure, such as roads to access markets before the crop spoils, storage and refrigeration to reduce waste, capacity for surplus. And technologies should be free based on best practices and science. And this access to information is another right that is guaranteed in the 2 great conventions. At the consumer level, each of us should be focusing on eating less meat and dairy, more seasonal crops, rely less on processed food, use local and organic whenever available, longer shelf life, root vegetables, things like that, to reduce the need for refrigeration and freezing, less packaging, eating less and wasting less. But the challenges of adopting these practices are that they are hard to make and sustain. The food environment is not supportive. In the United States, Kelly Brownell has described our food environment as a toxic, obesogenic environment. And it's not always clear what the consumer should buy. So finally, we can summarize in the way forward what Jonathan Foley captured in a Scientific American article in 2009. First, we have to stop deforestation for new farmland. The whole ecosystem depends on this. Second, we have to improve yields on existing farmland by reintroducing some standard things like crop rotation and the use of organic fertilizers. Third, we have to use our resources of water, fertilizer, and energy much more efficiently. Fourth, we must reduce food waste, 35 to 40% globally, a huge opportunity for us to make more food available to the people who are currently hungry. And then finally, we must eat less meat. If we cut back on meat, as the recent IPCC chair, Rajendra Pachauri, said, give up meat for one meal, 1 day per week initially, and decrease it from there. In terms of immediacy of action and the feasibility of bringing about reduction in a short period of time, it clearly is the most attractive opportunity. So whether it's meat-free Monday in the UK or meatless Monday in the United States, this movement is catching on, and we want to encourage people to shift their food footprint in the direction of sustainability, equity, and environmental preservation. Thank you again for this opportunity to share these ideas with you. I wish I could be with you to hear the other speakers and the discussion, both formal and informal. I wish you a very successful conference, and I look forward to hearing your conclusions.